evening. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. Welcome to Minority Rule, a conversation with journalist Ari Berman. We're delighted you've come this evening to learn about how the right wing has leveraged anti-democratic features of US democracy to entrench their power and subvert the will of the majority, and how we can fight back to demand the multiracial democracy we need. The Workers' Circle is a national, secular Jewish social justice organization founded by Eastern European immigrants who came to the United States fleeing autocracy and persecution and seeking democratic freedoms at the turn of the 20th century. That history drives our work for an inclusive democracy and human equality today. We're thrilled that tonight's program is co-sponsored by 43 democracy and civil rights organizations, partners with us in the grassroots movement to remake our democracy so that it represents us all. In moments, the Workers' Circle Director of Social Justice, Noelle Damico, will introduce Ari Berman and begin the conversation. We invite you to put your questions for Ari into the chat or the Q&A during the time, and we'll ask as many of them as time permits. We'll also be raffling off 3 free copies of Ari's book later in the program. You need to be present to win. And now it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to Noelle Damico, Director of Social Justice at the Workers' Circle.
Thanks, Anne. We're just delighted to welcome Ari Berman, National Voting Rights Correspondent for Mother Jones, a reporting fellow at Type Media Center, and author of Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. This is Ari's latest book, released just last week. You've read and seen Ari in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, NPR, and many other media outlets. He's won the Sidney Hillman Foundation Prize for magazine journalism, and tonight he's with us for an hour to talk about how we got to the place where our democracy is imperiled and what we can and are doing about it. Welcome, Ari.
Hey, Noelle, it's so great to be with you. Thank you so much.
It's really great to have you back. Tell me, let's just get into it. Why did you write this book? What message are you hoping breaks through to the American public right now?
And I want to thank not just you and the Workers' Circle for all your incredible work, but everyone who's on this webinar, the hundreds of people that I see rising in the participants, all the groups that have co-sponsored it. It's really amazing to see so many people turn out for this. And I also just want to thank you all for your hard work. I know it's sometimes easy to get bogged down by all the things that are happening to our democracy. So I just want to let you know that your work matters. And for me, it makes me feel like my work matters to see so many people on here. So I just want to thank you all for coming today. What really led me to write my book is, as you know, Noelle, I had been reporting on voting rights since 2011 and the new attack on the right to vote. And as I got deeper in my reporting, I began to ask myself, what is the purpose of this? Is the Republican Party just trying to gain a political advantage? Or is there something bigger at play? Is there a larger project at play? And I realized that project is minority rule, so that a shrinking conservative white minority would essentially be able to get a majority of political power, not by appealing to a majority of Americans, but by rigging the political system to entrench and hold on to power. And so I started with the contemporary problem, and then I went back and realized that this problem of minority rule has been with us since the founding. And I really wanted for people to understand that the crisis we face today is bigger and deeper than Donald Trump. That yes, Donald Trump is an accelerant to the democratic crisis we face, but he's also a product of a broken system. So I wanted to tell the movement to restrict democracy over the last 230 years, and I wanted to talk about the movement to expand democracy over the last 230 years, and how there's this push and pull going on, and we're once again at this pivotal moment where there's this major fight over race representation and political power.
All right, I want to pick up on that push and pull that you've just described. In the opening chapter, you write, America's democratic experiment has long been defined by a central tension over whether the government should benefit the many or the few. The United States has historically been a laboratory for both oligarchy and genuine democracy. That dualism is part of its DNA. At the heart of this debate are contested ideas about legitimacy, about freedom, and who counts as an American. Unpack that for us.
Well, you're a very astute reader, Noelle, because that is the central paragraph of the book. And I mean, really, what I wanted to show is that the United States is not one thing or another. There are these deeply anti-democratic currents that run through our history ever since the beginning, when the founding fathers created institutions that were meant to constrain popular democracy as opposed to expanding it and encouraging it. But there's also this incredible movement for democracy in our country, where rights have been expanded for many people that were shut out of the original governing institutions. And you have to understand both of those are part of our DNA. And you have to understand that because today we're seeing the same kind of thing, where there is this movement to try to overthrow American democracy as we know it, but there's an equally committed movement to expand democracy and to preserve multiracial democracy and go forward and expand our rights. And that's why I think we're at this critical moment, because the two movements, the movement for oligarchy and the movement for democracy, are happening at the same time. And the question is, which side is going to win? And will we be a country that commits to democracy and enshrines democracy, or will we be a country that commits to oligarchy, white supremacy, and minority rule?
Well, one of the things that encourages me is we had over 1,200 people register for this Zoom, which I think is an indication that the fight for the heart of a democracy that will represent all of us and really be a democracy by the consent of the governed is full, is strong, and is ready to take the next steps. Of course, since the January 2020 election, our nation has endured a violent insurrection on January 6th to try to stop the certification of President Biden. We've seen a tidal wave of new state laws to restrict the right to vote. The originalists on the Supreme Court overturned Roe, with numerous states now setting restrictions that effectively end the ability to get an abortion in many states. They've expanded the concealed carry while the horror of gun violence continues. And they've taken up the question of whether a president is immune from criminal prosecution, essentially whether the president is a king, someone above the law. Even as for the first time in history, a former US president is being tried for crimes and facing further criminal indictment. It feels like a great and sudden unraveling of a shared commitment to democratic norms and institutions. But your book, Ari, tells a different story, that these are neither sudden nor surprising developments, but rather part of an ongoing white, right-wing reactionary campaign of fear, as America's population and its voters have grown less white and more multiracial. And your book details the willingness of that reactionary minority to exploit undemocratic features of America's political institutions and their processes to entrench their power and impose their minority views. So let's start with that fear part. Take us back, Ari, 30 years ago to Pat Buchanan's presidential candidacy in the 1990s, where he began supercharging fears of white minoritization. How did the message end up prevailing 20 years later with the GOP itself?
Well, those are really good points you make, Noelle. And the reason why I talk about Pat Buchanan and I really start the book with him is he starts warning about the consequences of the changing demographics of the country for the Republican Party. The 1990 census which coincides with Pat Buchanan's first presidential campaign in 1992, predicts for the first time that the US will be a majority-minority country in which white people are no longer the majority. And Buchanan basically says that the impact of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, mixed with increased immigration, is making the country less white. And that's threatening white Christian America as we know it. And he basically says that the Republican Party needs to build a wall, quite literally, against this. And he calls for a Buchanan fence and all of these things that are later adopted by Donald Trump. And so what I argue in the book is that we have this anti-democratic political foundation to begin with that was created by the founding fathers when they created all of these institutions like the US Senate, like the Electoral College, like the composition of the Supreme Court that would preserve elite white power. But layered on top of this was this newer anti-democratic movement that was concerned with white power slipping away. And so they layered on all of these newer anti-democratic tactics like voter suppression, gerrymandering, restrictions on immigration, the rewriting of history, to essentially try to build that fortress to stop what they saw as the coming siege.
You know, Ari, you're naming anti-democratic features of our democracy, and for some people, that may be a surprise. So let's look for a moment at some of those counter-majoritarian features: the Electoral College, the Senate, filibuster rule as well. Let's look at how they got there to begin with. And unsurprisingly, slaveholder interests cast a long shadow. So let's start with representation in Congress and the Electoral College.
So the interesting thing is there's this fundamental contradiction that our nation's most important democratic document, the Constitution, was actually designed to make the country a lot less democratic, and in many ways represents the first counter-revolution against democracy in the country, because the founding fathers were very concerned with the power of the masses. And despite the rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence that said that democracy was based on the consent of the governed, the founders worried that if the public was given too much power, it would threaten people like themselves, this elite white male slaveholding minority. And so they started to build through the Constitution these buffers against majority rule. And so they create a situation where the Senate is not only designed by an elite body, and they say very openly it's going to be an aristocratic body, but then there's this huge debate over what representation should look like. And actually, a lot of the framers of the Constitution, the most important people like James Madison, actually want the Senate to be based on proportional representation. So the larger states would get more representation than the smaller states to preserve the legitimacy of the body. But basically, the small states rebel, and they say, if you don't give us the same level of power, the same number of senators, we're going to leave the Union and join a foreign ally. So basically, the small states hold the Senate hostage. Then, when it comes to the House of Representatives, which is directly elected by the people, because the Senate, I should mention, is not. Senators are going to be appointed by state legislatures and confirmed by the lower house. So the public is shut out of the Senate. But the public is going to directly elect the House of Representatives. But then the slave states come along and they say, if you don't give our enslaved population more representation, even while we disenfranchise them and enslave them, then we are going to leave the Union. So what happens is there are 3/5 clauses adopted, and Southern states don't have to give their enslaved population any rights, but they're counted as 3/5 of a person, which gives the Southern states a third more representation in the House than they would have otherwise had. Then when it comes to the Electoral College, the founders don't trust the public to directly elect the president. So they say that the president is going to be elected by this complicated system of electors, where voters aren't even going to vote for electors. In most states, the electors are going to be appointed, but the electors are going to be based on not just population, but it's going to be based on representation in the Senate and in the House. So the small states have more representation in the Senate. The slave states have more representation in the House. That means that both the slave states and the small states, these two privileged minorities, have more representation in the Electoral College. The net effect of this is that 10 of the first 12 US presidents are slaveholders, 18 of the first 31 Supreme Court justices are slaveholders, and almost every Speaker of the House for the first 4 decades of the country are slaveholders. So elite white power in the most odious ways are protected by the structures of the Constitution that are supposedly democratic, but are actually meant to restrain democracy in a lot of different ways.
Those are just stunning figures you just quoted. And certainly when I was in elementary school and junior high and high school learning history, that kind of focus was not put upon this telling of history. There was this very laudatory, the framers had freedom and equality in mind, and forward we go in this progressive history. But it's important for us to remember how this was already inside that constitutional framework. So we have these counter-majoritarian features that are in our democracy, originally put in place in the 1787 Constitution, and they're there to protect the power of white wealthy slave owners and elites. The framers of the Constitution did leave open the possibility that the Constitution could be amended, but definitely made it a heavy lift to do so. Some of us are still fighting for the ERA. And then the population increased, right? So it led suddenly to a majority of people residing in Western and Northern states, and aggrieved at the South's loss in representative power in 1850, Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina proposes that a state should be able to nullify any federal law it deemed unconstitutional. Now, Ari, when I was reading that, it sounded a lot like a headline out of Texas Today with regard to immigration policy, but discuss with us, if you will, this core idea of nullification, and then how the filibuster came to play a critical role in stopping legislation that was the will of the majority.
Yeah, so John Calhoun is a really pivotal figure. He basically holds every possible role in the government except for president. He's a senator from South Carolina, he's vice president, he's secretary of war, he's extremely influential before the Civil War. And he is the South's most ardent defender of slavery. He calls slavery not a necessary evil, but a positive good. So he's making an affirmative defense of white supremacy. And basically, the founding fathers were worried predominantly about class. They wanted to preserve slavery, but they mostly wanted to preserve the upper echelon of society that they represented. Calhoun wanted to preserve white power. He wasn't concerned with whether you were a poor white or a rich white person. He just wanted to make sure that white people were ruling over black people. And in states like South Carolina that had a black majority, he wanted to make sure the white minority would be able to rule. And he saw that the demographics of the country were changing, that the North had a larger population than the South, and that free states outnumbered slave states. And so he basically wanted express protection for the slaveholding South in the Constitution. He wanted there to be this idea of nullification, that if the South didn't like a law, it could just nullify it. And it would be remarkably difficult for the federal government to overturn it. And that idea of nullification basically leads to the Civil War, and it leads to the South to essentially nullifying the Union and fighting a war to preserve slavery. And then after the South loses the Civil War and civil rights measures start to get passed, the defenders of the South start using the filibuster to block civil rights legislation from ever passing. And so what Calhoun does is he both develops the architecture of white supremacy, the ideology of white supremacy that the South will use to rebel against the Union, but then he also puts in place the ideas for how the South, even after they're outnumbered, even after they lose, will block equal rights and will block civil rights for those formerly disenfranchised communities.
Well, to help us understand how reactionary white conservatives in our own time have leveraged anti-democratic features, in your book, you do a case study of Wisconsin, where the addition of partisan gerrymandering and dark money led to the state becoming what you called, quote, a laboratory for oligarchy. So talk to us about Scott Walker, the Bradley Foundation, the Koch brothers Foundation, minority rule in Wisconsin, and the lessons that were learned from it.
Well, what the Republican Party did at the state level was so critically important because, to go back to nullification, this was how they tried to nullify the election of the first black president in 2008 and the incredible coalition that elected the first black president. And so what happens in 2010 is Republicans get these majorities in all of these key swing states like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Ohio and Pennsylvania. And then they do everything they can to try to rig the institutions of these states so that they can't be voted out of power. And this is a particular strategy in Wisconsin because Wisconsin had been a progressive laboratory. It had been a state that gave birth to Social Security, to unemployment insurance, to collective bargaining rights. But what happens is when Scott Walker is elected governor, backed by all of these dark money and these conservative groups, Wisconsin becomes the epicenter for this minority rule strategy. They go after labor unions to roll back collective bargaining rights for public sector unions so that will defund and defang the biggest supporter of the Democratic Party and progressive causes. They gerrymander to such an extent that in the state assembly, Republicans get 46% of the votes in one election, but 64% of the seats, which is just stunning. They pass all of these voter suppression laws to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to vote. They say that they want to go after what they call college campuses and neighborhoods around Milwaukee, and they're clearly talking about black neighborhoods. Even when Democrats are elected, like in 2008 when the Wisconsin elects a Democratic governor, the Republican legislature immediately strips power from him in an unprecedented lame duck session. They route all of this dark money to make sure that Walker won't be recalled from office and that conservatives will have a majority on the state Supreme Court, which will then go on to uphold gerrymandering and union busting and voter suppression. And so I talk so much about Wisconsin as a case study because what I'm trying to show is that the Republican Party radicalized against democracy before Donald Trump. And it was the very fact that the Republican Party radicalized against democracy before Donald Trump that laid the groundwork for Trump. If the Republican Party hadn't already become an authoritarian party, they wouldn't have been looking for an authoritarian leader like Trump. And I think this is getting lost right now with all the focus on Trump's personality and not realizing that there was a much larger movement behind him. And it was a much larger movement to try to rig the institutions of American democracy, first at the state level and then at the federal level. And that's why I think Wisconsin's a fascinating story. It's also a fascinating story because I'm sure we'll talk about it. It's also changed, right? So it shows that politics can change, that rigged systems can become unrigged because those gerrymandered maps have been struck down and lots of things are different now in Wisconsin. So I want to tell the story of this push and pull for democracy and show that there's people that are trying to rig the system and there's people that are also trying to unrig the system. And Wisconsin's a state that shows both.
Ari, I think it makes sense to just talk a little bit about how in Wisconsin the system was unrigged by the concerted efforts of many people.
Well, first, it started with electing pro-democracy candidates and not electing Democrats because they were Democrats, but electing Democrats because they were committed to democracy. And that's a really important point because I'm not advocating for the Democratic Party. I'm advocating for pro-democracy candidates. Right now, that usually tends to be Democrats, but I think that the important distinction is small d, not big D, in terms of when you're talking about democracy. So voters in Wisconsin elected a Democratic governor. Then they elected a series of progressive women to the state Supreme Court. And that was the really critical thing, to flip that body. So then what happened very recently is after there was a progressive majority on the state Supreme Court, they struck down the gerrymandered maps that had been in place for so many years. And it was amazing. The Republican legislature, which had gerrymandered itself so aggressively, had to pass the governor's map, the Democratic governor's map, because that was the least bad option there. What that means is that in 2024, there's going to be democracy at the state level in Wisconsin for the first time, that the legislature is up for grabs. And this is critically important because what I argue is that all state battles right now are national battles, and that when it comes to issues like voting rights, issues like gerrymandering, issues like abortion, what one state does has a huge issue not in that state, but on other states as well. And so when Republicans rigged Wisconsin, they create a model that they could export to all these other key states. When Democratic forces unrig Wisconsin, that becomes then a model that you can say, let's try this in Georgia, let's try this in Texas, let's try this in other places that feel seemingly rigged. But we feel like over a course of elections, and remember, this is not just one election, it's a multi-year strategy to understand that what are the tools you can use to change things. And in Wisconsin, it was the governor's office, it was the state Supreme Court, and now it'll be the legislature. And these bodies can change. And so I don't want people to feel hopeless about the fact that it seems like our democracy is slipping away and there's all of this existential anxiety. Yes, I feel that too. But I also want people to realize there's models that we can build on to show how democracy can work.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason that so many organizations that are co-sponsoring this program tonight have also been working on voter mobilization strategies, working on ways to help people over barriers that have been put in their place by state legislatures. But it is a message of hope. We can and we must and we will take our democracy back. Tell us a little bit about Kansas, Ari, because there seemed to be another laboratory in motion there. In 2010, lawyer and former professor Chris Kobach, who was then Secretary of State in Kansas, linked illegal immigration to the false narrative of voter fraud to create the first proof of citizenship to vote law that more than a dozen states then used as a blueprint. You talk about what Kobach did as an inversion, actually, of what Pat Buchanan did. Explain that a little bit more to us.
Well, sounds familiar, right? Because Donald Trump is doing the same thing right now. He is saying falsely that migrants are crossing the southern border to illegally vote for Democrats. And so he's using the Kobach's language. And then, of course, he stood with the Speaker of the House and introduced legislation to require proof of citizenship for voter registration, even though it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in this country. But what I argue is that in the 1960s, people like Pat Buchanan, who came up with a Southern strategy, were usually using racially coded appeals to get white voters to the polls. But what I argue that Kobach did was he advocated both for restrictions on voting and restrictions on immigration, not just to bring white voters to the polls, but to quite literally make the country more white. And so he was advocating for a strategy that would entrench white minority rule beyond just advocating for policies, but structurally trying to change the system to do that. And so then when Donald Trump says after 2016, I would have won the popular vote if 3 million people hadn't voted illegally, another lie, the first big lie, as it were, he points to Kobach as the guy who's behind that claim. And then he appoints Kobach to lead this election, quote unquote, integrity commission, right? And this is the seeds of the second big lie. And they don't find any evidence of voter fraud. It disbands. But the thing is these people keep failing upwards. And the more discredited their ideas and their rhetoric are, the more it pushes deeper into the Republican Party, paradoxically. That it's being debunked in court, it's being debunked by fact checkers, it's being debunked by the media, but it's taking hold in the Republican psyche to the point where Trump makes even more ludicrous claims in 2020, takes even more unprecedented steps to actually try to overturn the election, incites an insurrection. And the more debunked the ideas become, the more popular they become within Republican circles. So I think some of these figures are very important because, like I said, they predate Donald Trump. And Kobach's another one who shows that the radicalization of the Republican Party predates Donald Trump. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to link claims of illegal voting with policies aimed at stopping undocumented immigration to keep the country more white, to protect conservative white power. And it's incredibly dangerous because it's not just based on a lie, but it's also based on structurally rigging the system and trying to, as I said, put up a wall quite literally against the changing demographics of the country.
And the result of all of that is actual voters do get disenfranchised by all this. In the name of a myth of voter fraud, you have actual disenfranchisement of people because either they've been purged from rolls or they can't get over the hurdles put in place around some of these voter ID laws, and it causes real harm. Now, it's not just that reactionary white conservatives have been doing what we've already been talking about, which is quite disturbing. They've also been busy taking over democratic institutions like the Census Bureau, or trying to. Many of us remember the "Are you a citizen?" question that was almost added to the 2020 census due to Kobach and his supporters' efforts. What was the impact of that failed effort on the census count and also on the ability of nonpartisan democratic institutions like the Census Bureau to resist such attacks in the future?
Well, it was critically important because it really was their version of an institutional coup, an attempted an institutional coup, and an attempt to try to rig one of the fundamental pillars of American democracy. Because the US Census is so important in terms of deciding how representation is allocated, how billions of dollars in federal funding is allocated. And it's the only thing in the country that counts everyone, whether you're young or old, rich or poor, citizen or non-citizen. And basically, the Trump administration wanted to change that mission from counting everyone to counting only certain people, so that if they rigged the census, they would then be able to rig political power more broadly. And a lot of information came out that they were doing it specifically to try to advantage white Republicans, and were using basically people that had a long history of gerrymandering and voter suppression were behind this. And I talk about it in the book because even though it failed, there was no citizenship question on the census, it had two impacts. Number one, the fear of the question actually led to an undercount, a massive undercount of minority communities. So basically, Latinos, African Americans, other people of color were counted less than white voters. So those communities are getting less power because of it. But just as importantly, they realized that if you can try to rig a fundamental pillar of American democracy, you're not going to stop there. There's going to be other pillars you're going to rig. And indeed, so many people that were involved in the census fight, Chris Kobach, John Eastman, Steve Bannon, they then move on to trying to overturn the election itself. And so first they tried to overturn one of the institutional pillars of American democracy. Then they try to overturn the democratic pillar of a democratic society, which is the vote. And so I think that I want to go back and spotlight in the book some of these moments that maybe people have forgotten about, but that are critically important in charting the direction of the Republican Party and charting just how deep the efforts at minority rule are.
Yeah. Ari, one of the things I really appreciate about this book is it's really a who's who of the major protagonists that have tried to remake American democracy and take us back hundreds of years. And they come up over and over again. For those of you who haven't gone out and gotten Ari's book, Minority Rule, I urge you, please, we've dropped the link in the chat before, we'll keep dropping it in. Get this book. It functions as a compass during these times when so many things are coming at us and our heads get spun around. It also functions as a kind of map from the past to the present, helping us trace these threads, name these tactics, identify the people responsible, and that helps us better counter what's going on. So speaking of something that's been underway for a long time, there has been a concerted effort since the 1980s for conservatives to take back the third branch of government, namely the courts. The Federalist Society, the Koch brothers, the Bradley Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, and dark money wizards like Leonard Leo have raised hundreds of millions of dollars to push preferred judges and justices onto the courts. Now, there are a number of groups on this call today that are pushing for ethics reforms at the Supreme Court. There are groups who have convinced the Senate Judiciary to subpoena Leonard Leo, and groups that are working to educate the public about how the court works and the impact of the court's rulings. Other groups are looking at the size and composition of the court. In your book, Ari, you call the court, quote, the most dangerous branch. Why? And how can we make the court more accountable today?
Well, because the courts have really become the epicenter of the Republican Party's strategy for minority rule, because they're trying to do all the unpopular things through the courts that they're not able to do through the normal political process. And so just to talk about the Supreme Court for a second, there's a few really undemocratic milestones of this current Supreme Court. This is the first Supreme Court in U.S. history where 5 of 6 conservative justices were appointed by Republican presidents who initially lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. So this is the most undemocratic court we've ever had in modern times. Secondly, that court, which is already a product of these broken institutions, has then made the country less democratic through things like gutting the Voting Rights Act and upholding partisan gerrymandering and Citizens United and all of these efforts to try to deepen the democratic crisis that we're facing. Then they've also done all of these unpopular things that would never have been possible through the political process. Overturning Roe v. Wade, overturning gun control efforts supported by 80 to 90% of Americans, gutting environmental protection. So they're making the country less democratic and also less majoritarian. And then they are playing a critical role in enabling Trump's authoritarianism, because I think it's really important to understand Trump cannot do this alone. He cannot take over as an authoritarian leader alone unless the checks and balances that are built into our democracy fail. And that's what he's doing right now by constructing the supermajority in the Supreme Court, by purging Republicans in Congress. They are trying to use the courts to enable Trump's authoritarianism. And it's not just the Supreme Court. In the lower courts, this was a shocking stat to me. 60% of Trump's appointees to the lower courts, to the appellate courts, which hear the majority of cases, 60% of those appointees were confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. So you basically have courts, not just Supreme Court, but lower courts as well, that constructed through minority rule, deepening minority rule in the US. So I think it's critically important to have some accountability for the Supreme Court. I believe that the current supermajority on the Supreme Court is illegitimate because of the way that it was constructed. And I think that leaders in the Democratic Party have made both a moral and strategic error by not talking about this more. I think they've made a moral error because I believe this court is illegitimate. But I also believe they've made a strategic error in not putting more pressure on the court. And I think it's good that Democrats in the Senate have taken this up, because right now we have a lawless Supreme Court with no accountability, no ethics. The fact that Clarence Thomas sat on a case when his wife helped lead the coup was just absolutely shocking. Lots of state Supreme Courts, I'll just give you an example. Lots of state Supreme Courts operate totally differently. They have mandatory retirement ages. They have fixed terms. They have judges who are elected. I mean, there's so many different ways that the Supreme Court could be structured. We don't need to have a situation where judges are appointed for life with no kind of accountability. So I would like court reform to be a much bigger issue. I would like the president to talk about it more. I would like Democratic leaders to talk about it more, and to understand that this is not just a fringe process issue, that if our fundamental institutions are rigged, then the decisions by those institutions are going to be rigged as well. And I don't know how much more we want to see. To me, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act was a huge wake-up call. To a lot more people, the overturning of Roe v. Wade was an even bigger wake-up call. Now the attempt to essentially give Donald Trump a lifetime get-out-of-jail-free card may be the biggest wake-up call. But the Supreme Court is leading us down a path to authoritarianism, and my concern is that they are playing such a key role in enabling Donald Trump, and they feel like there's going to be no accountability unless people demand it.
Yeah, well, the people are demanding it. And so let's talk a little bit before we go to the questions from the audience. And friends, I hope you're putting those questions in the chat and the Q&A. We're going to get to them next. Let's talk about the fight for our democracy, how folks are fighting back, because it's not only a fight of lawmakers in Congress and the states, but of ordinary people like all of us on this call tonight. Many on this call will remember our hard push for President Biden to urge Congress to lay aside the filibuster to pass federal voting rights legislation in 2021. More than 200 of us got arrested, some of us numerous times, in waves of civil disobedience outside of the White House in October and November September of that year. Biden agreed that fall to change his position and began urging the Congress to lay aside the filibuster and pass federal voting rights legislation. And he publicly credited voting rights activists with changing his position. And we didn't stop there. It was already too late in the game. And so we felt we needed to amp up the pressure. So in December of 2021, the Workers' Circle and Black Voters Matter, together with many organizations on this call, organized protests. Some of those organizations are here tonight. We were in 8 states pressuring those senators who had been hiding in the shadows on the filibuster to come out and say they were ready to lay it aside to pass voting rights. And we were successful in that. We convinced a number of these senators, and our pressure got that Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to the floor of the Senate for debate. For debate. We had a struggle to get it there for debate, but we got it to debate. And though it failed on the filibuster by 2 votes of Senator Manchin and Sinema, we did not give up. Many of us went out. We were arrested the next day in civil disobedience, saying that we were not going to give up on this struggle. And so we shifted our work then and started mobilizing people and helping provide information and resources to surmount the barriers to people casting their ballots. Phone banking, text banking, GOTVs. We're helping people get the voter ID they need, even as we're working to end the barriers to the ballot box. And of course, some folks on this call are working on ballot measures to secured abortion rights in Ohio, ballot measures now for Florida and elsewhere as a way of exerting the power of the majority against minority rule at the state level. And we hope that all of you on this call will join us and other co-sponsors of this program in these efforts. So talk to us, Ari, about some good news from the good state of Michigan and how the fight back there created a way where there seemed to be no way.
Yeah, so I end the book by talking about Michigan, and I have a New York Times op-ed today that I'd urge people to read on this. But I basically say Michigan is an example of how a state can shift from minority to majority rule, and how seemingly rigged state governments can be unrigged, and how the voters themselves, everyday people themselves, can start organizing to ban partisan gerrymandering, to expand voting rights, to enshrine abortion and other rights. And so I think Michigan's a really important case study for how reform can happen. And I would just say that what I think people should do is 3 things. Number 1, preserve the rights and freedoms we have now before it's too late by electing pro-democracy candidates. That's number 1. Number 2, build a long-term movement for structural institutional reform. That means reforming the filibuster. That means changing the composition of the Senate by putting in new states like Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico to make it more reflective of the country. Abolish the Electoral College or try to change it through the National Popular Vote Compact. Things like that. And understand that some of this stuff is not going to happen overnight. That the right wing in the 1960s and 70s, when they had basically lost the battle against the civil rights movement, laid out a 40-year blueprint for institutional change. And some of this stuff is going to take a long time, but there has to be a commitment to doing it. And like you said, you came very close. Activists came very close to doing this in the Senate, to passing the most important voting rights legislation since the 1960s. And I think if for some reason, and if it does happen, that Democrats have majorities in both houses of Congress and the president is reelected, I think there will be the votes to pass voting rights legislation and other transformative legislation in a next term. So I think build that long-term movement for systemic change. And then number 3, organize at the state and local level. And this can happen anywhere. It doesn't just have to happen in swing states like Michigan. Those states are important, but there's lots of places in everyone's backyard where there's a need for some kind of change. Voting laws can always be improved. Systems can always be unrigged. And so what I'm saying is there's pathways forward. I spotted Michigan as one way that democratic rights can be expanded. It's not the only way, but I think at a time when minority rule feels like it can be inevitable, or certainly feels like a clear and present danger, we have to understand that there are models for democracy that have been successful and that can be emulated.
Thank you, Ari. Before we turn to your questions, we want to announce the lucky winners of 3 free copies of Ari's book. Congratulations to Gail Silverman, to Teresa Harper, and to Ron Katz. We're so glad you're with us tonight. We know you'll love the book. We will be in touch with you following the program. Now, if you didn't win the raffle, you can still get your very own copy of Ari's new book, and we're going to drop that link to do so into the chat. So Ari, with the minutes that remain, let's turn to some of the questions from the audience. A question from Jim: is not the 2025 project the real final part of minority rule? And Yvonne adds, what are your concerns about Project 25?
Well, just so if people don't know, I mean, Project 2025 is basically the blueprint for the conservative movement for authoritarianism. And the thing that concerns me is, number one, just how radical it is. And then number two, who's behind it. That you have the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation and all of these groups in the conservative ecosystem that are backing this attempted authoritarianism. And I think if Trump were to win, the agenda for authoritarianism would be much more organized than it was in the first term, where it was very much seat of the pants in terms of Trump's agenda. I think that the conservative movement has learned its lesson, and they want to put in place the most radical attempt possible to undermine American democracy in as quick of a time as possible. And so I think it's extremely alarming that they're basically saying, this is our agenda for the second term, and so many major figures in the Republican Party and the conservative ecosystem have gotten behind it.
Thanks, Ari. And friends, we'll be sure to send out a link on Project 2025 in our follow-up email, where you'll also receive a recording of tonight's program and additional resources so that you can keep taking action with us for your democracy and our democracy. Barry wonders, Ari, does the Democratic Party need organizations similar to what exists in the conservative world to create pipelines into government and generally drive the progressive agenda over the long term?
I mean, I think it's certainly true that the Democratic Party and the progressive movement could be more organized. I was always kind of shocked by the level of organization that existed in the conservative movement. I will say that I do think that the Democratic Party at the grassroots level is more organized than it was. I think, for example, if you look at state level activism, much more organized, many more groups working on these issues than there were before. The pro-democracy movement's as strong as it's been in a very long time. So I think that the effort to try to rig the political system has led to a very vibrant movement to unrig it. And I think it's shown by how many groups got behind changing the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation, how many people co-sponsored this event. I mean, I think that it's very strong. And I think that the thing that's really important is people have to link democracy to the issues that people care about in their daily lives, and understand that if our democracy is rigged, then so many of our fundamental rights and freedoms are at stake. And if you care about a women's right to choose, or clean air and water, or the criminal justice system, or so many other issues, it's impossible to accomplish any of that as long as our democratic institutions are so skewed. And that's why I think that democracy is the most important issue to organize around, because you make democracy work for more people, and that unlocks so many other rights and freedoms.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's one of the reasons Workers' Circle shifted to make democracy the priority for all of our work. And I know there are so many other groups that are similarly reorienting around this urgency right now. Now, a question that's from someone in our audience: if we were to change the filibuster, get rid of it, even if it's only confined to a specific area, say voting rights, can't that turn it into a weapon that Republican senators could use if and when the Republicans have the majority? This is a particularly urgent question, as it will be a tough year to maintain Democratic control in the Senate.
Well, my feeling was always that if the Republicans want to do it, they're going to do it. I mean, listen, they got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices when they wanted to get rid of it. And so the minute they feel like the filibuster is hurting their cause, they'll get rid of it. And so I think it would be better if the Senate operated on a majority rule basis, because I think there's many more things that the filibuster is blocking that are good than bad. And I think that the right's been very successful in getting their agenda through in other kind of ways, or just abolishing the filibuster altogether when they want to stack the courts, for example. And so I think it would be better if we reform the filibuster so that you could enshrine the right to choose, or you could enshrine the right to vote. I think that that would be so much more urgent. And I think that saying you're not going to do it because there's some fear of some kind of other outcome, well, I think that other outcome, if Republicans want it, will happen regardless.
Marcy Geffner has a question. Where does Christian supremacy versus religious pluralism and separation of church and state fit into this political history?
Well, I think it's really part of it, because I think what the shrinking conservative white minority wants to enshrine is the idea of the US as a white Christian nation. And I think if you look at kind of who the demographics are of the people that are pushing so hard for minority rule, they tend to be the most radical elements in terms of trying to make America a white Christian nation, as opposed to a nation that is much more diverse in terms of its composition or its beliefs. And so I think that kind of white Christian nationalism and white supremacy right now go hand in hand. And I think it's very dangerous, and I think it's at odds with our history, in which, kind of one of the ideas of America was that it would be a refuge and a haven for people of all types, those who believed and those who did not.
Yeah. There are a lot of people concerned about the Supreme Court and sending a lot of questions our way about it. One question was, whatever happened to Biden's commission to investigate reforming or expanding the Supreme Court? I kind of remember a big report being put out, and then it feels like it went on the shelf. Ari, what do you know about that?
Well, I mean, that's exactly the perfect example of how Democrats have not made the court a top priority, because they just did the classic Washington thing, which is let's just create a commission that nobody actually follows. And there were a lot of really, really smart people on that commission. And I think that this should have been a thing that was center stage, that the president embraced, and that could have come up with some really innovative ideas for changing the composition or putting some accountability into the Supreme Court. Instead, he buried the issue. And I don't understand why a president whose agenda is going to be thwarted at every turn by the current supermajority of the court would want to bury it. And I think the thing is, to me, the frustrating thing is a lot of Democrats feel like we're going to create some kind of democratic illegitimacy if we start talking about the crisis of our democracy. But that moment has already occurred. When Mitch McConnell blocked Merrick Garland 8 months before the election, and then put Amy Coney Barrett on 2 weeks before the election, that already had eroded Democratic legitimacy to such a point that it was Republicans that tarnished the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court tarnished it through their own actions. And I think it's just been a fundamental miscalculation by the president to not, A, elevate the issue of the court more, and then to B, not talk more about possible solutions to the court. And let the smartest people in the law profession come up with some ideas, and let's debate them as opposed to just burying the issue altogether.
So Ida is curious, how do you suggest we reform the Supreme Court? There are certainly a lot of proposals out there. Do you have any particular suggestions that you think are the strongest or most effective ways based on your research and study?
Well, I mean, I don't have one policy that I think is a cure-all, but I think just in terms of, I've done a lot of research on state Supreme Courts, and I've been struck to the extent that state Supreme Courts are obviously not perfect, but the extent to which they're very different than the US Supreme Court, that they have term limits, or they have mandatory retirement ages, or they have fixed terms, or the size of those courts have at times changed. So, I mean, I personally think that the current court should be expanded, and I think the current court should be expanded right now, because I think the three-member the three people that Trump appointed, I think, all have legitimacy problems for different reasons. And so I think there would be certainly an argument for a one-time adjustment to the Supreme Court based on the way the current majority is rigged. But I'd also like to see the court operate with a lot more accountability. And I'm not totally sure that the whole idea of justices appointed for life through broken institutions with no accountability and no ethics is the best thing for our democracy right now.
So continuing on the court line, Jim says, didn't SCOTUS asserting Citizens United begin the real start of minority rule? How does Citizens United decision by the court impact or further inflame this effort toward minority rule, Ari?
Well, it further inflamed the effort by giving kind of the ultimate minority, which is conservative white billionaires. You can't really get a more powerful minority than that to basically allow them to buy the political process in secret. And so certainly in terms of the modern effort at minority rule, because remember, I trace minority rule all the way back to the founding of the country. So, I mean, minority rule has been with us from the beginning, but certainly the more modern effort at it was supercharged by Citizens United. And it had an incredibly negative effect, not just on the federal level, but on the state level as well, where so much dark money was routed through places like Wisconsin to prop up the agenda of the radical right. And even still to this day, we know almost nothing about the workings of groups like the Federalist Society that have had such a big impact in terms of rigging so many of our democratic institutions.
That's right. And some of the groups on the call, like the Declaration for American Democracy, has been part of pushing for the Disclose Act, pushing for transparency requirements, in addition to pushing for the passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both of which would not only restore the beating heart to the VRA, but expand it in important ways and reform our democracy. Ari, for a last question, in your closing chapter, you discuss what you call the gerrymandering of history. What do you see happening now to our ability to tell the truth about our past and our present?
Well, thank you for asking about that, because I think it's incredibly important. I think the modern day effort to erase history, which I call the gerrymandering of history, which has many forms, from banning books to censoring how race and other issues are taught to denying that things like slavery caused the Civil War. I trace that back to the vicious backlash against Reconstruction. When America had multiracial democracy for the first time in the South, it was violently overthrown, and then white historians rewrote the history books to preserve white supremacy. And this is a history a lot of people don't know. And I think it's so critically important because it's happening again today at a moment where there's once again this major fight over race representation and political power. And if we don't, the famous quote is, if we don't learn from our history, we're destined to repeat it. And I think there was an attempt to whitewash our history so that white supremacy would be protected. And I think at this moment where we are on the verge of becoming a majority minority country, where we are on the verge of having a multiracial democracy that's the norm rather than the exception, there's once again these attempts to try to rewrite, censor, and restrict history so that we don't acknowledge and deal with the inequities of racism that still exist today. So I think that the current day effort to gerrymander history is linked to all of the anti-democratic tactics, and it's another way in which the right is trying to enshrine these anti-democratic tactics. And so I think it's incredibly important that we're accurate about our history, because listen, things like slavery, things like Jim Crow, things like the 3/5 clause, they happen whether we like it or not. And we have to learn from that history and correct that history if we're going to create a more perfect union.
Ari, thank you so much for being with us this evening, for helping us learn our lessons well and our history better, for giving us hope in these difficult times, for charting a course forward for all of the activists on this call. Thank you for your book, Minority Rule. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, all 43 organizations who are working so assiduously to ensure that we one day truly will be a multiracial, multicultural democracy that represents all of us. And especially I thank all of you in the audience tonight. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your presence. Democracy only works when we put our whole selves into it. It is an honor to be shoulder to shoulder with you in this fight. And on behalf of the Workers' Circle and co-sponsors, we thank you for tonight. Look for our follow-up email with more resources that you can use to get in this fight and stay in this fight. We'll see you on the front lines. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.